Hi, I'm Rachel Lance, and I'm here today to talk about my upcoming book, Chamber Divers, which discusses a little-known aspect of World War II, including the underwater physiology that was eventually used to make the D-Day landings at Normandy a success. I'm going to get back into my background a little bit later in the slides for reasons that will become apparent. But for now, what you need to know is to set the starting scene, we are in France, 1942. We're approaching a small resort town by the name of Dieppe. Dieppe is kind of one of those picturesque vacation locations, an area where rich people go to lounge on the beach in this tiny little town with rich, fancy houses along the shoreline, but nestled between broad, soaring, gorgeous cliffs. It's been this kind of luxury resort area for decades, if not centuries. At one point, even being considered so beautiful that it was the subject of not just one, but a series of paintings by Claude Monet, who was inspired by the soaring white cliffs on either side of the small French town. In August 1942, however, Dieppe was a very different place. Occupied by Germans as part of the more generalized occupation of France, Dieppe was known, or at least suspected by the Allied countries, to hold crucial intelligence that might be the key to breaking the newest version of the Enigma machine, which the German Navy and including submarines, were using to wreak havoc across the Atlantic. Deciding that an attack on the small beach town might be the best way to obtain this information, try and gain a foothold in Europe, and even ambitiously open a second front against the war on the Nazis, Churchill and the Allied leaders decided to try one of the first major beach landings. However, intelligence on the beach was limited. We now know, based on pictures like this one taken after the war, that the Nazis and the German troops had not only enforced the houses along the shoreline, but dug their way into the picturesque famous cliffs themselves, building guns and nests for those guns inside what was formerly Monet's pet scenery. What the Allies had instead were photos from vacations. Pictures of actual vacation and tourist memories, people lounging on the beach with parasols and fancy dresses as they watch the tide roll over the peaceful rocks on the shore, the cliffs still in the background but unoccupied by guns. These photos, which were scavenged together by people who had previously visited Dieppe, were some of the main and only pieces of intelligence used to plan the landings on these sensitive shores. And with them, the Allies sent in their troops and hoped for the best. What happens next is one of the greatest disasters in military history. The troops being used were mostly Canadian. The Canadians had joined the war earlier, but been mostly sitting unoccupied and unutilized in Great Britain. So as they started clamoring for action with the ultimatum, give us something to do or send us home, Churchill decided that they might be the perfect fodder for this attempted beach landing. This is a scene painted after that landing. As the troops started to swarm the rocks, they tried to unload the tanks and heavy equipment in real time, forming dense clusters of soldiers for those machine gunners and bombers nestled in those high cliffs above. The gunners were able to aim downward easily from those dugout holes, and they were able to pick off these clusters of struggling troops. With the troops that were in the first few waves dead on the shore, there were a few soldiers left to help the tanks and struggling other vehicles unload properly from their vessels, as had been the original plan. With that, many of them were left abandoned as the remaining survivors struggled and ran for cover. A lot of the engineers were in the first wave, meaning they were the ones carrying the explosives that were intended for use to break the German barriers, to break the seawalls and help the tanks and vehicles gain entry into the town so that they could penetrate the forces more off the beach. However, almost all of these were killed. A lot of them were carrying explosives on their packs as they chose to unload, and those explosives were flammable when hit by bullets, turning a lot of those engineers not into combat personnel but into running bombs. Some of them chose to dump their munitions, but others chose to try and run forward anyway, trying to sacrifice themselves in the hopes that maybe they would still reach some of these barricades, blocking the struggling tanks and other personnel from leaving the rocky shores. Every single one of them failed. After the battle was over, the tanks were found on the beaches by the remaining German troops. The abandoned vehicles were damaged and unusable a lot of the time. Several had simply tipped over, many had lit on fire. A lot of the reason for that was because of something unexpected. The improper and inadequate scouting photos used by the Allies to plan for the attack had not shown with enough detail what this beach was actually made out of. Instead of sand, like the few times that they had practiced on in England, the beaches of Dieppe are small stones. These smooth rocks, polished to a glossy sheen by the waves, caught in the tracks of the tanks, and a lot of them simply threw the tracks off, rendering them completely useless and leaving them even more vulnerable. The beaches and the landing at Dieppe were divided up by color. No one made it into the town. Some barely reached past the barriers, but no one on the Allied side was able to approach their objective. The vast majority were either killed or taken captive. On Blue Beach, one of the most disastrous beaches, the casualty rates were as high as 95%, with the lucky ones surrendering. After the carnage and after the regrouping back in England, the Allies realized what they had done wrong. Among other things, they had kept sending wave after wave of troops in the hopes that eventually one would force their way through, leaving them all as nothing but fodder for the gunners and the batteries inside and above those high-soaring famous cliffs. However, the errors had actually started a lot earlier than that. The errors had started when they failed to get proper scouting. Pictures of people lounging on their vacations are not sufficient for an advanced beach assault, especially one that you hope to be successful in on terrain that you don't know well, like the rocky stone beaches. The Churchill tanks they had used had been untested in combat and had never been tested on that type of terrain before because they hadn't had sufficient information about what they were about to do. They realized that what they needed, at the end of the day, was better intel. The trick was going to be how to get it. Meanwhile, by the time of 1942, the war is in full swing for at least England and many of the European countries. In Britain, the heat of the Blitz has waned a bit, but people are still being subjected to not anymore nightly, but weekly bombings by the Luftwaffe soaring overhead. So these bombings on the downtown areas of London are one of the most infamous events in military history, with this massive widespread targeting of civilians that not only served as a military action, but served to terrorize and bring horror to the general populace. A lot of the citizens of London who had no choice to evacuate ended up surviving anyway by taking any kind of shelter they could against a level of homeland combat that few of us are able to imagine today. Many of them spent their nights simply sleeping preemptively in the tube stations in the underground for some kind of shelter, where the vast majority of the reports indicated that they had almost given up on their personal safety. But the reason that the tube stations were so pleasant was because they no longer had to listen to what was happening. Without the constant noise and the constant reminder of the war going on above them, they were finally able to sleep. It's in that kind of environment that the Allied leaders were experiencing this pressure to understand better what went wrong at Dieppe, how to prepare for the next beach landing, how to get this intelligence that they so badly need. And finally they decide, planes are obvious, above water ships are obvious. What we really need to do is send our spies underwater. People have been dreaming about traveling underwater since at least 200 BCE, where we see our first reports of alleged submarines, whether or not those are actually true. Leonardo da Vinci even drew drawings of preliminary concepts that he thought could be useful to help people survive underwater and get that oxygen that we so badly need. his designs would not have worked, but he indicates that this was a common thought process throughout human history. However, at the time, what diving would have looked like still required equipment that was something like this photo. Now, this is actually the best case scenario for the time period. This is an era before Jacques Cousteau's invention of scuba, which he was working on with his partners in Nazi-occupied France in parallel at the same time. At the time, to get underwater required incredibly heavy lead boots, a full body suit, often a metal helmet, just like in the movie Men of Honor, and tons and tons of weight to help keep you on the bottom of the ocean floor so you didn't become a cork. On top of that, the best way to get a gas supply was to have a team of friends pumping it down for you through these thick corrugated hoses from a vessel above you. Not subtle at all. Not only did you have the ship up there, but you had the massive release of bubbles as well. And on top of that, in terms of submarines, the technology was still developing too. We think of World War II as an era where submarines were prevalent, but the reason that they were able to work was because people were only using them on a large size scale. Dreams of miniature submarines had been around, especially for applications for military use, for centuries already, but most of them had met with limited, if any, success at all. The most successful one would have been the Civil War's H.L. Hunley, during which all 8 of the crew still died. The rest of the prototypes that were developed during that time and after for such miniature submarines were usually not effective at all. And a lot of the reason for that was because we didn't understand the breathing mechanics of survival underwater. Even just before the war started, the Allies had realized their lack of knowledge in the most stunning and horrific way. In the summer of 1939, 3 Allied submarines went down in training missions in rapid succession. Their sinkings were largely hidden so that they would minimize the fear and concerns of the populace and also of the submariners being asked to get inside the other vessels. But in May of 1939, the USS Squalus sank during a training mission. In June of 1939, the HMS Thetis sank during a training mission, as did the French Fénis, or Phoenix, which to this day still remains lost. These submariners inside all died of asphyxiation, lack of fresh air supply inside these enclosed hull, in large part because there was not only the disaster of the sinking itself, but because there was limited knowledge about how much gas they needed to survive. One person who had an unusual and relevant background was geneticist John Burden Sanderson Haldane. He's pictured here on the left. So JBS Haldane understood submarines and survival underwater because he'd been born into it. This domain was almost his birthright. His father, John Scott, is still credited as the father of the science of decompression sickness, meaning he was the first scientist to really create profiles that let divers return from the deeps without getting the deadly affliction we call the bends. And JBS Haldane, the son, had been on board the ship for every one of those experiments. John Scott, the father, had died the year before the sinkings of 1939. So when they happened, JBS Haldane perked up. He heard about them and he knew, of anyone, I may be the one to be able to help. Shown here, he's in the Spanish Civil War, where he acted as a volunteer because of his devout communist beliefs, where he's using the experiences gained in the trenches of World War I to demonstrate and better develop gas masks. So he and his whole family have spent their entire lives working on breathing systems, to the point that they have a literal gas chamber in their own home where they conduct experiments as a group. The first people that JBS Haldane recruited to solve the mysteries of the submarines, including the Thetis, were his friends from the Spanish Civil War. Seen pictured here, you can see his relative size. He called himself a fat man. He was a large person, and his heft and his might made him really impressive, including the volume of his voice. So he was this force to be reckoned with. And the 5 of them got together and decided that they were going to run experiments on themselves in order to start figuring out what the Allies needed in order to breathe underwater. The tools they were used were called hyperbaric chambers. Thick, sturdy constructions made of rounded steel. These chambers are designed to hold inside lots and lots of pressure. They're designed so that you can pump pressure in and simulate the depths of the ocean from within the steel tube, so that you can run experiments, test equipment, design things without needing to throw it in the depths of the ocean every time. JBS Haldane and his colleagues started by locking themselves in the chambers, closing the door, and pumping in carbon dioxide until they began the first explorations to figure out what was needed to keep people alive inside sunken submarines. The other major question that was brought into focus through the failed landings at Dieppe was how to get more independent swimmers out there. This idea of the miniature submarines was important, but it was kind of a pet project by a niche branch of the Admiralty. A lot of them also were looking at how do we get people in the water? How do we get people on the beaches without being detected? Now again, this is before scuba, which even then that makes lots of bubbles, so it makes it fairly easy to spot a diver in the water. So Haldane and the associated researchers start looking at these underwater escape apparatuses. Originally designed to help submariners escape from sunken submarines by giving them a small quantity of oxygen, these leather bags were strapped to the chest of an escapee who then tried to go out through the escape hatch. They worked theoretically, but they had really limited success rates. Only a few people had managed to use them. Only 4 out of 103 managed to get out of the downed HMS Thetis. So the questions were not only this atmosphere inside the submarine, but also why weren't these devices working? As the Admiralty started to use these and tried to use them for deliberate underwater attempts as well, people started having mysterious accidents. People started disappearing under the waves, and nobody could understand why. So JBS Haldane and his lab of geneticists, who are actually largely mathematicians by training, start again experimenting on themselves. They use the hyperbaric chambers at this dive company, that Seba Gorman, that was located in downtown London. And amidst the still falling bombs of that ongoing bombing, they locked themselves time after time inside these metal chambers, closed the doors, put themselves on the breathing apparatuses, and waited to see what would happen to their bodies. One of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this topic, and this is finally where we're going to talk about who I am a little bit, is because sometimes I do the same thing. I am a researcher. I'm a biomedical engineer. So I have my PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke University, and I specialize in injury biomechanics. So I specialize in what happens to the human body when we try to go places and survive doing things that our bodies are not naturally supposed to be able to do. We have not evolved to survive underwater. We have not evolved to escape from submarines. Maybe one day, but we're not there yet. And understanding what will keep us alive in these kinds of worlds is a crazy and adventurous type of science that requires constant experimentation and exploration, because not only is this an unbelievably hostile environment to people, it's a hostile environment to instrumentation. So where you see me here pictured inside one of the chambers at Duke University, where I conduct my human subject research into this field of science, we not only have to count on the volunteers who are willing to take us and to continue the experiments started during World War II, but we also have to build all of our own equipment. And the same thing was true of the Haldane and his original lab of scientists. So in order to talk about what these experiments were like, I'd really like to focus on one particular scientist. I cover a lot of them in the book, but there's not enough time for full profiles of all of them today, even though they genuinely deserve it. They're all pretty spectacular people. A lot of them were refugees. So many of them had fled from Hitler's forces as he crept across the European mainland, and they received refuge in the UK only because they were young budding scientists and they were willing to come over and test, not necessarily on themselves, but participate in the scientific community of the free Allied countries. One of the scientists who participated in this refugee program was Hans Krebs. So I don't know if there are any nerds listening in. Hopefully everyone here is some kind of nerd. But the Krebs cycle is one of the fundamental questions of the function of our metabolism. And it's not well known, but Krebs actually came over to the UK fleeing from Hitler. And he then did his groundbreaking research. So the one person whose story I'd like to focus on today is Joan Elizabeth German. Her family members and extremely close friends used to call her Betty, and everyone else would call her Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was a young woman just starting out in life at the start of the war. She had these incredibly firm communist beliefs because she was raised by a single mother. Her father had been killed in a horrifying car crash, and her mother worked really hard to give her the life that she wanted her daughter to have. And her uncle, whose wife had been driving the car when her father was killed, felt really guilty about that, so he was able to send her to high-end boarding schools to try and support her and make her life as positive as possible following that difficult start. So she grew up with this intense contrast between watching economic struggle on some level, but then also being in these incredibly wealthy environments. And what that meant was that she became a very popular belief at the time period, which was a practicing communist. So young Elizabeth German, she was slim, she was fit, she was an incredible lacrosse player, she rowed crew, she learned scientific German for fun, and she graduated with a degree of chemistry, and then in her free time she would stand on the street corners of London selling the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker. That activity is how JBS Haldane heard of her. When his secretary fled because of the ongoing bombings in London, he needed a new one. And because it was the 1940s, a young woman with a degree in chemistry and a slew of great grades who also speaks German was considered sufficiently qualified to be the secretary for a prominent scientist. But she was qualified to do research in her own right. This woman was incredibly brilliant, and she soon became involved in these experiments alongside JBS Haldane to figure out how to turn people into fish. Several months after the landings of Dieppe, Elizabeth German put on an underwater breathing apparatus, like the ones designed to help escape from submarines. She strapped it to her chest. She was wearing a full suit of diving gear, and she climbed down into the water tank at the Seabeck Gorman test facility. After she plodded around the bottom for a while, like a really strange walking fish, she decided that there was a slight valve problem with the breathing apparatus. She was getting a little bit of a weird response from it, but it was sufficient for her to continue that day's experiment. She climbed the ladder outside the wall of the tall cylindrical tank, and she plodded soaking wet across the wooden floor into the second test facility they would use that day. This one was a vertical hyperbaric chamber, so it was a cylinder tipped on its end with the top and bottom rounded. Someone else once compared the top door of this chamber to one of Mr. Churchill's famous hats, so it looked like one of his domed boilers. She attached herself to a pulley that was linked to the ceiling, and then a team of attendants helped lower her body inside the water-filled metal tube. JBS Haldane climbed in after her. He seated himself on the small platform that was above the level of the water, and then either he or someone outside the chamber lowered that domed Churchill hat-like metal cap down onto the roof and sealed it shut. The chamber was then gas-tight. From the outside, chamber operators began to not only note the time of the experiment, but to spin the valves that would pump additional air inside. Elizabeth German sat and waited patiently inside the cold water at the bottom of the well, in the bottom of the metal well. She breathed on the apparatus, which continued to give her a minor bit of trouble, but really nothing substantial, and it kept working as the chamber pressurized to depth. By the time they reached about 50 or 60 feet, Elizabeth noticed that something was wrong. These devices, it needs to be said, used pure oxygen because they didn't understand very well how much oxygen people really needed when diving. They didn't really understand the effects that nitrogen would have on people very well. They just decided to simplify them. And even though these things had been used or were recommended for use down to depths of 300 feet, they were filled with pure oxygen for the wearer to breathe. Elizabeth noted that something was wrong. She had a tablet. She began to write that she felt odd. She never completed the thought. She began to have a seizure. Someone outside the chamber noticed through one of the viewing portholes that her body was twitching. She was spasming. Her legs were flailing. She was having a seizure, and she was having it underwater. So thankfully, these breathing apparatuses had straps that held that mouthpiece in her mouth for her. But if she managed to dislodge it, she would almost certainly start inhaling water and drown. They had to ascend the chamber first, and they began depressurizing it as quickly as possible. They dragged Elizabeth out using the same pulley system attached to her back, and she lay recovering on the wooden floor of the platform above the hyperbaric chamber. Elizabeth German was the first diver in history to discover that oxygen can cause neurological symptoms up to and including seizures underwater. They had known this before because other members of the group had compressed themselves in the air to levels where they got seizures. But she was the first one to do it in the water and demonstrated that at depths beyond 50 or 60 feet, a seizure is almost a guarantee. Most of us would be deterred by this, but this group continued. And eventually their work, which escalated into roughly 700 experiments, all conducted on themselves, resulted not only in the development of the X-craft, which are miniature submarines, only about 40 feet long, that could hold a maximum of 5 people, but also in breathing apparatuses. By the end of the war, the Allies were frogs. They were able to use not only full oxygen rebreathers strapped to their chest, but they were able to use blends of oxygen and air that allowed them to dive to shallow depths deeper than what oxygen alone would provide, but let them still rocket to the surface in the event of a bomb going off. In June of 1944, the Allies were prepared. The small, diminutive X-craft had lurked outside the shores of the beaches destined for the D-Day landings on not just one but several missions. Because of the breathing experiments done by Haldane and the rest of his group, they knew how much absorbent they needed to bring on to control the levels of carbon dioxide to let themselves stay submerged during the daylight hours. They came to the surface only at night to refresh their gas supply and creep ashore, but these scouting missions allowed the collection of sand. It allowed the collection of measurements. It allowed the careful mapping of the beaches. And on June 6, 1944, these tiny X-craft lurked, having spent several days in advance marking the beaches for the British landings. The U.S. beaches, infamously at Omaha, were missed. They had the opportunity to use marking by the X-craft, and they declined, showing the sharp contrast over the level of preparation available when you understand physiology. After the landings, it was urgent to clear the beaches as much as possible. Divers using breathing apparatuses that had been tested and they'd been provided with safety measurements resulting from this group's experiments were able to dive underwater. The original plan at the British beaches had been to do so during the landings itself, but this wasn't hugely practical because of the number of ships overhead. But they were able to go afterwards. They did careful searches of the water. They combed for ordnance. They looked for ordnance attached to those infamous obstacles, the hedgehogs, the posts, the element C that line those beaches. And while the taking of the beaches at Normandy can never be said to be easy, one thing that was certainly a non-event was that there were 0 divers lost to issues like oxygen seizures or diving-related accidents due to lack of information. And a lot of that can be traced back pretty directly to the experiments of the chamber divers. Okay, so hopefully that was my 30-minute opportunity to tell one of my favorite stories of history and one of my favorite stories of military history. A lot of what they're using now is still in use today. The sources were classified until 2001, so this is really the first opportunity for this story to be told in an open fashion. And unfortunately, it happened after all of the group who actually did the work was passed away. But their children have been very excited to learn about it, and as have their grandchildren. And so hopefully this is now a story that we can tell and we can give these people their proper honor. I would now be happy to take your questions.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
I'm great. Where are you joining us from?
From my home in Durham, North Carolina.
You're above water, yeah? You're
I
on
this
right
time,
down.
yes, this time. But if you could see the rest of the room, you would see how much diving equipment there is, including on the floor tucked out of view. So,
Thanks for a great presentation. That was really fascinating. I have one question to start off with. Oh, by the way, thank you for joining us. That gave a really new, interesting perspective on D-Day. Are you excited about the 80th anniversary? Are you your book's coming out when? When's your book coming out?
the book comes out April 16th. I've already started to kind of begin the ramp up the publicity, which is really exciting. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this story. And so getting the opportunity to talk about it and to talk about what these people did is a big honor for me. But yes, I'm excited for D-Day for the 80th anniversary. I have never actually been to the D-Day beaches. I was doing a lot of the research for this book during the heat of the pandemic, which made such travel difficult, if not impossible. And so I'm planning on going over. So I will be over in the UK to hand deliver copies of the books to the surviving family members, and then make my way over to France to see the beaches myself. So,
Oh, great. Well, you can always come with us. We have a trip in May. It might be, it's not D-Day itself, but we go in May because it's less chaotic and crazy.
yeah.
So I want to come back to Dieppe because, you didn't say this, but so many people have said, oh, the loss of an entire Canadian division at Dieppe in one of the greatest debacles of World War II, if not military history, it was worth it. It was worth all those thousands and thousands of Canadians being captured, killed and wounded, because we learned so much from Dieppe that it made D-Day itself, 6th of June, a success. Now, I don't buy that. I think it's a way for Mountbatten to be let off the hook. But did we actually learn something really important for Dieppe that made a critical difference on D-Day, or didn't we?
I don't think that we learned anything new. I think it reinforced what those with experience already knew. But it really hammered home the lesson for the less experienced commanders. So before Dieppe, you even see in Churchill's writings that he's deeply aware of how complicated these beach landings are. Churchill, of course, was in World War I, and he was largely responsible for the appallingly failed beach landing at Gallipoli. And so his troops were stuck there for months and months, and he had that experience in his background as a leader. So heading into Dieppe, he was very resistant to the idea of that landing. The issue was that there were others who didn't have similar experiences and were not listening to what he had been through. So, in my opinion, it didn't necessarily teach anyone anything new. I think that's the optimistic veneer that they put on it to justify the deaths and to justify what were essentially mistakes. And that's supported by looking at the news reports afterwards. Like, if you look at the American and the British news reports, and I went back through and I listened to the way that they were reporting these landings, they were simply lying. They straight up said it was a victory and it accomplished exactly what we had wanted to accomplish, which we now know was completely untrue. So I think they were trying to tell themselves that.
There were a couple of important discoveries amid the tragedy. Number one, it was not a good idea to attack a harbor or a port, a heavily defended port. That proved to be disastrous. And number two, they did see that the beaches, there were large pebbles on the beaches at Dieppe. and that
Right.
made the landing of tanks, etc. It was very, very difficult indeed. So, it would have been a good idea not to attack a port that was heavily defended, and number two, to find out how you could get vehicles across a beach. So we did learn from that, didn't we?
Yes, that's
Right.
true. And we learned the importance of testing on a beach with the same level of composition. Because when these scouting troops were leaving from the X craft missions in January through the spring of 1944, they had like machine gun ammo bandolier type carrying cases across their shoulders, but they were for tubes to fill with sand. And so as they were approaching in, they were creating these heavily detailed maps of where they had taken each soil sample, which when they brought those back to England, they then had sediment specialists who were analyzing the soil samples. And that meant that the beaches that everyone was practicing on in England prior to D-Day were selected specifically because they had similar types of sand to the actual beaches used in Normandy. And so they did learn that lesson very much, like that the beach composition was going to be really important and that they needed to give not only the troops, but the equipment a test run first on as close of a situation as possible.
I've cheekily posted a couple of images in the chat, and I'm not going to test you too much, but do you recognize the photograph at the top? That's from the USS Tang in October of 1944. Do you know about the Tang?
Yes, I'm familiar with the story of the Tang. I've been to the World War II Museum as well in New Orleans and done the Tang experience, which I always highly recommend to anyone who's not had the opportunity. But yes, the story of the Tang is one of the ones that's very well known in the submarine escape community. Prior to my time at Duke, I worked for the US Navy for 9 years, working on underwater breathing systems. And part of that was submarine escape and understanding these stories. Yeah. So
The reason why I posted that photograph there is completely selfish, because I wrote a book called Escape from the Deep about the USS Tang,
I'm
and
aware.
that's
Yeah.
where the museum based it on my book. They haven't sent me any royalties yet, but anyway, that's another subject. What's interesting there is that the escape from the Tang in October 1944 is, to this day, I believe, the only time that Americans have escaped from a submerged submarine without assistance from the surface. Am I right in saying that?
I believe you are correct as far as I know.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think it was 180 feet below the surface in the Straits of Formosa, which is near Taiwan today. And the guy below, that's his grave there. That's Hayes Truckee. Can you see the grave there?
Mhm.
So he pioneered what is known today, and I'm sure you know about this, a process, or rather a method of escape that I think is still used at depths above 300 odd feet below the surface, which was called blow and go. So the reason why I mention this is because you can maybe add some detail in terms of the physiology, etc. He was climbing up an escape rope that was pitch black, and every 10 feet, he had to stop at a knot and exhale so that he could equalize the pressure in his lungs to avoid the dreaded bends. And he lost control. His grip loosened and he couldn't find the rope. So he simply breathed out slowly, as he'd practiced actually before he went aboard the USS Tang. He breathed out slowly and then shot to the surface. And because he was breathing out as he rose, he survived. His lungs didn't explode. And after the war, they said, "How did you survive?" There were only 5 guys from, I think, 87 on the Tang that lived. And he said, "Well, I grabbed onto this rope, I couldn't find it, and I just breathed out slowly, and that became known as blow and go." And no one believed him. The US Navy said, "That's impossible. How could you have done that?" But in fact, they questioned him extensively. And today, blow and go is a technique used at certain depths. But anyway, that's my
Yeah.
spiel. Can you
No, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that I laughed about a lot as a former government employee was the bureaucracy involved in trading this information between the British and the US.
Yeah.
So I've got the documentations where the scientists are begging, like, please, can we just organize it like this? And they draw flow charts. Please, can we just communicate with each other? But of course, there's always someone up above who gets their ego in a twist and makes it a little bit more challenging. So the United States frogmen, when they were doing this stuff, and they were largely training down at Fort Pierce, they had access to the US version of the same military escape apparatuses, but they were not necessarily planning to use them for diving. They decided to use breath hold. But that submarine escape technique became prevalent everywhere. And actually, one of this group, the chamber divers, I'm not sure if he heard about it from Truckee. Sometimes, I'm sure you know, the order of things gets a bit confused in these documents. But he also did a similar experiment on himself where he put himself inside these chambers and he decided to see if he could escape from 300 feet with just one breath of air. So not with the apparatus at all, simply exhaling and letting the air in his lungs expand as he rose up, but exhaling it. And he made it to the surface from 300 feet on one breath. So he proved that that was actually possible without the apparatuses at all. But yeah, they were very much experimenting this, and they were developing these techniques as they went. They really hadn't tested any of them at all. Like you said, that was 1944. So you can tell that they had not tested these extensively before the war.
So we have a lot of comments and some questions, but I just wanted to point out to everyone, lest we forget, that the submarine service, I think it had the highest fatality of any of the American services in World War II per capita, and arguably was the most effective in terms of strangling Imperial Japan in the Pacific. So we should not forget that the silent service played a hell of an important role, very heroic role in World War II, and are often forgotten. How many of those submarines were actually present on D-Day itself?
Great question. So, oh gosh, I would have to check my notes to give you a guaranteed number, but it's important to remember that these were not fighting vessels. These were used to mark the beaches. So there were about 4, there may have been 5, but I want to say 4. And they were used to mark the perimeters of the British landing beaches. So Chamber Divers, the book, when I wrote it, I really wanted to end with D-Day. Because especially as an American, a lot of the history we're told about World War II is Pearl Harbor, and then a time warp occurs, and then D-Day. And so there's not very much in between. Whereas in reality, there's this incredible amount of preparation. And building and developing these X-craft were a big part of that. So the X-craft's presence at D-Day, they went there a few days in advance. As we know, the landings were delayed by a day, so they were really just positioned underwater, lurking offshore. There's this amazing record from one of the submarine crew where they use their periscope and they're watching German troops play on the sands at Normandy in the days just before D-Day as they're marking these positions for the troops to hopefully come in between the worst of the German gun batteries. But yes, it was a small number of them. And once the landing beaches had been firmly established and marked, that was actually when their job was done and they were able to leave and go home, because after 3 days in a tiny, tiny vessel, they were physically exhausted.
So we have a question from Richard, which is a statement to fantastic presentation that needed to be told. Did these boffins, in quotation marks, work at all with those involved in aviation? Was there any kind of cross-fertilization there?
Oh, Richard, it's like I fed you a question I wanted to answer. So perfect.
Best audience and the best questions.
Yes. So yes, they did. The breathing principles of survival underwater and breathing apparatuses are extremely similar to those involved in aviation. So even today, our conferences are the same conference. We have the 2 groups. We just hang out together. But there is an entire chapter in the book where I want to give the aviation people their credit. And I've been very excited to be watching Masters of the Air, which is obviously emotionally difficult. But in that, you'll see a lot of the importance on their breathing apparatuses and a lot of the breathing apparatuses that they're using. So the way that this development was occurring was the Brits were focusing mostly on underwater and the Americans were focusing mostly on aviation, and they were exchanging that information back and forth. So the American counterparts were doing the same thing, and they were also experimenting on themselves. So the breathing apparatuses that you're seeing in Masters of the Air, especially for the B-17, they trace back to a man named Randy Lovelace, who, I don't want to say he stole a B-17, but he definitely borrowed it without permission, took it up to something like 25,000 feet, put his prototype breathing apparatus on himself, and then jumped. And his whole goal was to see whether that breathing apparatus was sufficient to survive a cabin depressurization at those altitudes, for example, from flak penetrating the cabin hull. So yes, there's huge amounts of crossover between these two groups because a lot of we need to breathe in both environments. So,
you know, it's interesting when you think about it, the amount of sharing that went on between the Brits and the Americans when it came to technology, when it came to improving fighter planes. We're going to talk to a wonderful gentleman next who flew one of those planes, a P-51. Did you come across situations where there was a limit to what the Yanks, you guys, would share with us? Where, I mean, the atomic bomb is the classic example, but did you find that there were certain areas where the British were saying, you know what, that we could use that after the war, we're not going to let them know too much about that, or the same with the Americans? Did you find any kind of limits to the sharing of vital information?
Not really. A lot of the sharing, once the official channels were established, they then let the scientists talk more directly with each other. And these scientific groups in both countries really seemed to realize how precious every single data point was, and how difficult every data point was, and how much it impacted their end user community, which is the active duty military. So when left to their own devices, the scientists really just traded everything they could. The only things that I found were really the classic example of someone higher up in the government who wants to be consulted and they need their ego appropriately soothed before they'll allow it. But aside from that, there was very open channel between the British and the Americans, at least based on the topics that I was reading.
So we have a statement from Clarice, and she says that, I hope Elizabeth, the amazing woman that you talked about, has been recognized in professional women engineering societies like SWE. She is a hero for women in engineering at a time when women's participation was early and needs to be acknowledged. Can you talk broadly about the liberating effect on female boffins and nerds of World War II? Was it a moment, was it a period of great emancipation when everyone realized that women were just as smart as men, in fact, perhaps in some cases much more capable?
I feel like you're trapping me.
No,
This is a trick question from a fellow historian, because yeah, I think you've probably had similar experiences where once you get into the historical record, it was an epiphany moment for me, especially as a woman in science and heavily male-dominated science. It was an epiphany moment for me where I discovered that the women have always been there. Like our modern portrayals of the time period do them a disservice by continuing this attitude that they were not there, that this was all men and they were at home, which of course is like extremely important even in times of war. But the women were in the labs and the factories, and they existed and were doing this work. It's just that they don't typically get included in the histories. And so when I set out to write this book, I actually didn't really know who I would find in the lab as I started digging them up, because the first few documents were actually the all-male group from the Spanish Civil War. And I was very surprised and happy to find these female scientists in there, and to be able to include their stories for what they've done as well, because they've been left out of the story otherwise. Yeah, so unfortunately, there was no great moment of emancipation. These women served in this unusual way, and they accomplished these extraordinary things. The women in the book actually had their achievements stolen from them. So there was another scientist at the time period who took their work, plagiarized it, claimed it as his own, and then published it verbatim as his own work. And it's actually going to be a bit of a surprise to my scientific field when they find out that his book is largely plagiarized from these other scientists. So I actually screenshotted Clarice's comment because I'm going to pass that off to Elizabeth's son, who will be thrilled to hear it. And I agree, and getting her and the other female scientists involved, some level of recognition is one of my goals, since so much has been taken from them.
Wow, that's a great revelation. Can you name the guilty party?
I do. I name him in the book. His name is Ken Donald, and he went on to be one of the Admiralty's high-ranking scientists. But he never had such a similarly extraordinary scientific achievement. So everyone was like, oh, Ken Donald, his contribution to the field was these oxygen tests. He never really achieved anything similar to in magnitude after that. And now we know is because he stole it in the first place. So
one question here from Mike. What was learned from the X-Craft operation prior to D-Day against the Tirpitz?
Okay. So the X-Craft operation against the Tirpitz. The X-Craft had some of these early operations, and they were genuinely learning experiences in the non-Dieppe fashion. But they learned a bit about how the German Navy was using creative and a variety of ways to defend their major vessels. So as these X-Craft were going in to attack the Tirpitz, to sink one of these major gems in the German naval crown, they learned that the Navy was not necessarily using consistent methods of defense, and that the methods that they had practiced with the X-Craft were more challenging in a real combat scenario than in their practice scenario. And that seems a little bit obvious now, but you also have to remember that these were personnel who were operating underwater. And so they were operating, planning to be undetected all the time. So what happened with the Tirpitz was they went down and they had divers who could exit the X-Craft using these breathing apparatuses and cut through the netting. So they managed it to a certain degree, but there were a lot of issues with entanglement. There were a lot of issues with the fact that once the Germans were then aware that the attack was going on, they were able to throw ordnance in the water. Underwater explosions are actually the topic of my doctoral dissertation. And that was fun. But they're a lot more injurious underwater than in land. So even a small explosion very far away could cause huge amounts of trauma to the divers. And so those are some of the things that they were learning through the X-Craft, was that they needed a way to use divers that involved less complexity.
Great. We're unfortunately running out of time. I just wanted to make sure that everybody saw my message, which was a blatant advertisement for your new book at that website there at Penguin Random House. You obviously share the same publisher as me. I would urge everyone to go and get this book. It's not only is it a great read, but it's also really important history. You know, we listen to all these blokes in tweed jackets bang on yet again about Stalingrad and so many other battles, etc. And they often don't actually say anything new, but you have, and you do. So thank you very much for being with us. It's been a great honor for us and fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you so much for letting me tell this story. I think as someone who also uses case studies in my work of where military action went wrong, it was really remarkable to me and a new experience to be able to tell a story of where things went right because of the huge amount of sacrifice that had been made beforehand. So I wanted to kind of switch the perspective and show, like, here's a story of where everything went right and nobody died, because all of the sacrifices had already been made in the planning stages.